All right, everybody, hello. Thank you so much for joining us at Recognizing Preprint Peer Review. I'm going to, actually, let me just say, my name is Janine Stevens. I run the conference program here at Janelia, and I have had the great pleasure of working with Jessica and the other organizers in getting this workshop off the ground. So I'm really excited that you guys are all here. So on behalf of HHMI and Janelia, I want to welcome all of you that are here in the room and all of you that are joining us virtually, both on Zoom and on YouTube. We're very excited to have everyone. I have just a few very quick housekeeping announcements, most of which are on this slide, before we get into all of the good stuff. So first, excuse me, a very simple request. For those of you in the room, please silence your cell phones so that they don't interfere during the talks. And for those of you on Zoom, please keep your mics muted unless you are giving presentations or asking questions. I also want to remind everybody that all of the plenary sessions here in this room are being both live streamed and recorded, and they will be posted on HHMI's YouTube channel following the workshop. Breakout sessions, however, those are closed. They're only for the formal invited participants, so they are not being streamed or recorded. For those of you who are participating in the breakout sessions, please observe the Chatham House rule, which essentially is you are free to use what you hear, but you cannot reveal the identity or the affiliation of the person who said it or anyone else in the room. So we do ask that you please ask before you share anything. For those of you giving talks, the schedule is really, really tight. You can probably see that. There are printed agendas outside of the room, as well as the electronic copy that you were emailed. We do ask that the speakers please try to stick to the time that you are allocated in the program. And to help you do that, there's a timer. There's a timer up here to your left in the room, and there's also the same timer on Zoom, so our Zoom presenters will also be able to see it. In terms of questions, they won't be taken after each talk, but they will be incorporated into the discussion periods. So for the in-room audience here, it's really, really important that you use microphones to ask your questions or to make comments, because otherwise the virtual audience will not hear you. And in terms of microphones, we have two different types. We have the standing mics that you see in either aisle, so you're welcome to go up there and use them. And we also have catchbox mics, which we're going to throw around the room. They're very soft. Don't be scared of them. We'll throw them to you. You can throw them back to the moderator. You can throw them to someone else, but they work really well. And so it's a quick way to get to everybody's questions. For the invited participants who are joining us on Zoom, we ask that you please go ahead and raise your hand on Zoom, and we will then call on you to ask your questions. And for our YouTube audience, we ask that you use Slido. So let's see, am I there yet? So yeah, so we're using Slido during the meeting, and it's particularly important for our YouTube audience, and that is a place where you can write in your questions, and the moderators will be taking them during the discussion periods. And you can reach Slido at slido.com/preprint or slido.com with the hashtag preprint. And the hashtag is asked for on the slido.com site. I do want to point out, importantly, though, that Slido is for everybody in the meeting, whether you're virtual or in person, because not only is it a forum for texting or writing your questions, but it's also a place to upvote the questions, which is really kind of cool. It helps the moderators to really prioritize what's most important to everybody. So really everyone should be using Slido, and there'll also be some live polls conducted over Slido. So this is how you access Slido, and I believe on some of the future slides, Jessica also has this information to get you to Slido, so just keep that in mind. Last but not least, and very importantly, I do want to point out that HHMI is committed to fostering a diverse and inclusive culture where people of all identities and from all backgrounds feel welcome, safe, and supported in openly sharing their ideas. Hopefully, all of you took a moment to review the expectations for HHMI events document that was sent out in advance of the meeting. If you did not, the crux of it is summarized nicely on this slide here. We certainly hope and very much expect that you will not experience any issues during the workshop and during your stay here at Janelia. But if something does arise or you have any concerns, please don't hesitate to reach out to any one of the 3 HHMI organizers of the workshop who are noted here on this slide. We will be happy to talk with you and try to address any situations that arise. And with that, I conclude my housekeeping and turn it over to Bodo.
Welcome, everybody, to this workshop on recognizing preprint review, whether you are in the audience or whether you are listening in virtually. I'm Bodo Stern. I'm the Chief of Strategic Initiatives at HHMI. And I thought at the beginning of this workshop, I'll take us back to the very beginning of scientific publishing. The Royal Society, which was founded in 1660s, started the first scientific journal, the Philosophical Transactions. And the motto of the Royal Society is nullius in verba, take nobody's word for it. And what the fellows of the Royal Society wanted to signal with that motto is they didn't want to be dominated by authorities telling them what the truth is. They wanted to rely only on statements, scientific statements that were derived from scientific data, experimental data typically, that were published. Fast forward into the 20th century, and we are introducing peer review into the scientific publishing process. And fast forward again to a few years ago, when we have this new, so initially peer review was designed typically to advise the journals whether to accept the paper. And so most recently, we now have a mode of peer review of preprints, that is that doesn't have to advise journals. And I think this mode of preprint suddenly allows us to apply this model of the Royal Society, take nobody's word for it, to peer review. Take nobody's word for it. Let the peer reviewers and the peer reviews speak for themselves. And so in the next 2 days, we will discuss how this form of peer review, preprint peer review, the preprints that have peer reviews attached, and the peer reviews themselves, how we can use them and how we can recognize them as funders, as institutions, as scientists, as journals. And so I'm sure everybody here and on the listening in is just as excited as I am to hear what people have to say and the ideas that are emerging from those discussions. Okay, I'm handing it over to Jessica to tell us more about the goals of the meeting.
Thank you so much, Bodo. My name is Jessica Polka. I'm Executive Director of ASAP Bio, and I want to lay out a little bit more framework about what we're here to discuss today and tomorrow. So just so that we're all on the same page, we're here to talk about preprint review. So not just a registered report, not a data set, but a scholarly manuscript that is prior to journal acceptance if it is submitted to a journal at all. And we're going to use 2 terms during this meeting, preprint feedback and preprint review. We consider both of these to be things that are done and submitted by humans. So there's a huge wealth of great technologies produced by the Automated Screening Working Group and others to help provide other types of commentary on preprints, but here we're discussing human-created feedback and preprint review, which we consider to be a subset of that feedback, which we'll hear more about the distinction between these 2 terms in future talks. So this is a complicated ecosystem that consists of many different players, where I think one of the great strengths of what is emerging in this space is that there's a big variety of approaches being taken, from kind of minimalist or free-form styles of commenting, highlighting, all the way into journal-like peer review that, for example, is characterized by coordination by an editor and a more structured process. But I just want to highlight that really the foundation of all of this is, of course, the preprint servers. And as preprint uptake is still something that is not evenly appreciated in all disciplines and across all geographies, I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. And the other thing that I'd like to highlight here is that with this wealth of preprint feedback initiatives, I think one major challenge is to get a handle on the terrain of the space and also the linking and discovery tools that are providing this insight are very important. So we have representatives here from a variety of different search tools. Some of these preprint review entities receive DOIs, and there's also protocols and frameworks emerging for transmitting information about them. So how much of this content is there? As I mentioned, it's a little bit difficult to provide absolute numbers given the disparities in how they're represented and indexed. But there certainly are thousands of preprint reviews, with many of them, those in blue, being found on Society. And there's also some preprint reviews that are appearing in Crossref as well, with some overlap between those two pools. And I think that we can also estimate, though not know for sure, that there is a significant fraction of this body on bioRxiv itself, where it's been estimated that a certain fraction of the comments on bioRxiv are these full peer reviews. And from that basis, we can get a sense that they make a significant contribution to the overall number of reviews. So just to clarify again, I think there's so much to discuss regarding preprint feedback, including, the best practices for researchers and, other considerations. But today and tomorrow, we're really here to discuss the creation of policies from the funder, institutional, and journal approaches that foster this public discussion of these papers, both from the perspective of recognizing preprints that have reviews and also from the perspective of recognizing the reviews themselves. And so we've split the meeting into these 5 sessions. Of course, we're now here in session 1. In session 2, we're going to be talking about recognizing the preprints from the perspectives of funders and institutions. In session 3, we'll talk about recognizing the preprints from the perspective of journals. And then we're going to talk more about recognizing reviewers tomorrow before we discuss all the things that are necessary to support the ecosystem. So this includes how to cite the preprints with reviews and the preprint reviews themselves, the indexing and visibility of these objects, and also what is necessary to sustain this ecosystem into the future. I want to highlight that we have breakout sessions in session 2, 3, and 4, and polls, as you see here at this session and also tomorrow. So with that, I will hand it over back to Bodo, who will introduce our keynote speakers.
Our first speaker is Erin, president of the Howard Hughes Medical Institute.
Didn't need to get up there to say that. Is that my... Okay, yeah.
Yeah, you got it.
Oh, good. Thank you. All right, well, I'm really delighted to be here, and thank you to Jessica and Bodo and Ron for organizing this. I think I'm really looking forward to an exciting, especially the discussions. So I'm going to talk about this Publish, Review, Curate, or PRC model, as I'll refer to it. Right. So in 2018, I presented at a meeting about peer review, and the meeting was co-organized by HHMI, Wellcome, and ASAP Bio. And this is really a very simplified version of a slide from that presentation. And at the time, we recognized that Publish, Review, Curate, or PRC, as I said, in short, should be the future, at least included in part of the future of scientific publishing. And of course, this isn't a new idea, and it's not our original idea. Others had promoted this concept much earlier, all the way back to the late 1990s, when then NIH Director Harold Varmus proposed eBiomed. And the core feature of PRC, of course, is this flipped publishing process. And instead of reviewing and curating articles before publication, peer review and curation happen after publication. So a flipped publishing process, of course, gives authors more agency in the publication step, focuses peer review on evaluating the science that's already published, And finally, it enables diverse forms of curation that can still include things like journal selection, but also allows for other forms of tagging to add useful information to articles. So the problems we identified at the 2018 meeting, they remain the same. Publishing research is still an onerous and lengthy process, in part because editors decide what to publish. And we feel that authors should be trusted to share their work when they feel that it's ready. The peer review process still primarily serves to inform an editorial decision. And this link between peer review and the accept-reject decisions is, I think, not the best for science. Peer review that primarily informs what is essentially a business decision, and that's what an accept-reject decision is for a journal. It serves primarily the brand and the revenue of the journal, and is not always perfectly aligned with the interests of science. And instead, we feel that peer review should be uncoupled from accept-reject decisions. And this allows peer reviewers to focus on what the original intent of peer review was, and that is to evaluate the rigor and significance of the author's work and to improve the manuscript. So finally, this accept-reject paradigm, of course, leads to long rejections, resubmission cycles, which generate tremendous waste in time, in dollars, and in intellectual capacity. And of course, PRC is a potential solution to this. Since that 2018 meeting, a lot has changed. So even before the pandemic started, there was a major uptick in the use of preprints. And during the pandemic, of course, preprints were critical for the timely release of COVID-19 research. And as a result of this, we saw many examples of post-publication review that Jessica shared with you on that slide, and a diverse ecosystem of preprint review mechanisms has emerged over the past few years. But the predominant mode of publishing hasn't changed. And so what actually needs to happen to bring about structural change and make PRC the norm? Most importantly, I think we need to reevaluate what matters in our assessment of research and realign our processes to reflect this. And that's, of course, what this meeting is about. How can we acknowledge that a reviewed preprint and the preprint reviews themselves are valuable scholarly contributions? And I'm looking forward to the discussion around this topic. So I want to take this opportunity to project where this work could lead us in the future. And one tangible idea could be to re-envision what scholarly references look like. The purpose of a reference, of course, is to credit other scholars for contributions that have shaped our thinking and research, and to allow us to compile our own contributions in a standardized format. Unfortunately, the current practice unduly centers the journal name in the reference. And of course, this is a relic of a print era when you needed that information, the journal name, to actually find the paper. But now, of course, all we need is a link. But we've preserved the journal name, and it serves now as a signal to convey perceived impact on top of the actual scholarly contribution. And this further entrenches what I think is a misguided notion of the journal as a proxy for quality. So we should strive towards a future where scholarly citations focus on the science. If we want to reference scientific discoveries, we link to the author-based author-released primary research article. If we want to reference scholarly critiques, we link to the peer review reports, which should therefore be recognized as first-class citable scholarly contributions. So I don't see a reason why scholarly references need to include the name of journals. I see good reasons why they should focus on crediting authors of primary research articles, and also on peer review reports. And really, this isn't so futuristic. It already happens today, as this example on the right illustrates. So the world isn't here yet, but there's plenty we can do to bring it about sooner. Authors should be encouraged to share their work as preprints and to invite feedback from the community. And reviewers, in turn, have finite capacity to conduct reviews, and we suggest that they should insist on investing their time more wisely. And instead of conducting reviews for journals who use those reviews to inform a binary decision about publication, they should instead invest that time in work that has already been shared publicly. They should invest in delivering high-quality, transparent reviews that stand as scholarly contributions in their own right and hold value, not just for an editorial outcome, but as a good faith aid to the author and as a point of reference for readers about the rigor and validity of that work. So I'll stop there, but before I close, I want to thank Bodo and Michelle, who really, they made all my slides, and with whom I've had many very engaging discussions about this topic. So thank you very much. That's that.
Yeah, James Fraser from UCSF is the next keynote speaker.
Great. Thank you so much, Bodo. I'm really excited to be here because I think since the first meeting that we had here in 2016, we've made so much progress in recognizing preprints as a research product. And for many, including myself, it's really something that stands as, co-equal to journal publications. And the publish, review, curate model is just so inspiring, and it's the obvious way forward. So we're gathered here today in recognition of the fact that public preprint-centric review can make preprints even more useful, not only to the authors, but also to the consumers of that research, the readers, the general public. It has all these benefits that we've been outlining, eliminating duplication of effort, streamlining the whole process. From the reviewer's point of view, it contextualizes the work. It gives us an opportunity to help clarify things that we had trouble understanding, improving the interpretability. And one of the big problems right now is this big red question mark here, which is, really, this relies on a journal prompt right now, right? To advise, and mainly that journal prompt is to advise the eventual accept, reject decision by the journal. And as Erin just said, maybe this is not the best for science. So I think we need to look at the examples that we've been going through in our community over the past 6-7 years with author control of preprint submission and see how we can take a little bit more researcher control, researcher agency in review. And so really, I'd like to eliminate a lot of the journal prompt and see how often we can get people to just read an interesting preprint, or maybe a confusing preprint, or maybe an exciting preprint. Maybe those are not mutually exclusive. And then start to publish their reviews. So how do we get this scenario to happen more frequently? Well, that's what we're excited to talk about at this meeting. How we align the current incentives that we have, how we shift them so that we can reward incentives that change the culture from gatekeeping to one of iterative improvement, of collegiality, of rapidly improving science. And I think public review really creates a mechanism to do that. It creates a mechanism for scholarly contribution that can be valued alongside the preprints. And I'm so glad that that's a big emphasis of what we're discussing here today. And I think we can all play a big role in helping on this last point here, sort of how we can credit the reviewer, how we can reward and align the incentives so that people will read interesting preprints and be compelled to comment on them. Funders can do this by help recognizing the outputs. Deans and department chairs can use public reviewing activity and the collegiality of public reviewing activity in promotion activity, hiring decisions. Working scientists can help by modeling good behavior and figuring out ways to include all groups in these activities, figuring out ways to provide protection for those who need anonymity, for fear of retribution, etc. And I think we're at this really exciting moment where we're going to be doing a lot of experimentation about figuring out the right way to do it. And what I hope that we come out of this meeting is not just a single set of recommendations, but a spirit where many people are experimenting with different ways of doing it so that different institutions, different funders, different scientists can figure out what they value the most. And so what I'm going to do now is perhaps pretty typical for those who know me well. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my experience with public review. The rest of the talk is very self-centered. So in my lab at UCSF, for about the last 5 years, we've done exactly what was just suggested. We only review preprints. And we do it in many different ways. And I've been shocked at how much this actually contributes to the group, how it changes the discussions of what we're reading and how we're thinking about it. And I've also been shocked when I tally up the amount of words that I write and compare it to the manuscripts my lab produces and the grants that I write. It's about 1/5 of my scholarly output. And before I started posting all of this stuff, that 1/5 was entirely behind closed doors. And you don't have to be as in love with your own reviewing activity as I am to appreciate the fact that, this is some valuable stuff that's often being locked up behind closed doors. So our reviewing activity really occurs on many different platforms. We've been experimenting with using the bioRxiv preprint comment platform Discuss, which we like because the comments are right there. Sometimes we use pre-review, which we all like because it has a DOI, although you have to get through many clicks on bioRxiv to actually see the full text of the preprints. We've also been experiencing with what I think of as sort of many different modalities of peer review as well. In the top example, we were invited by a journal to review it, and so we wrote a review. Of course, monitoring the conversation on Twitter about the preprint and incorporating that into our review. And then wrote, a news and views for the journal, that incorporated some of the text from our review, remixed it in little ways. In the bottom example, it was just something we decided to do because we thought the preprint was really cool. And then the journal editors contacted us and added our review into the peer review process at that journal. And in fact, we had to jump through all the hoops of registering the account and resetting my password 5 times to make sure the author's paper could get accepted quickly. I also, occasionally will do things like recruit a bunch of reviewers, offering them the anonymity of, me acting as editor to review papers. And we've experimented with that as well. And this was a case where we posted all the reviews and then the author was able to just take it to a journal and get it accepted in one day. I also experiment a lot with incorporating reviewing activities in my teaching. This is something I learned from my faculty mentor at UCSF, Vale. I organize a peer review course where students have the option to remain anonymous or sign their reviews, and they review papers in teams and learn really how to review papers not from the point of view of trying to find mistakes, but trying to make things clearer, trying to understand the context of the work. And it's really, really hard work. Even our first-year graduate students have already got this mentality that peer review is about finding flaws. And it's really hard to work that out. So my goal for this meeting is to figure out how we catalyze this culture shift, valuing the reviews themselves, valuing this process. And my message to working scientists is that we should strive to incorporate preprint review into every scientific activity possible. In our teaching, in maybe even admissions to graduate school, in interviewing candidates for postdoctoral fellowships, for faculty positions, in promotion decisions for our faculty, in lab group meetings, in conferences, in preparing people for careers outside of academia. There is so much benefit to embedding this public, collegial, and rapid review that I think we can really transform science in a positive way by making it much more widespread. So my final message is that researchers should not be waiting for these systems to be perfected. The folks in the audience here, you all are going to be the ones who perfect these systems, but I think it's going to be like peer review, iterative over time. It's going to take a while to come to equilibrium. With preprints at the first meeting here, we didn't know whether people were going to be posting preprints months before submission, or coincident with submission, or after the paper had been sent for peer review, or after a round of peer review. And different groups have found their own ways of making it work for them. I think it's going to work really similarly with review, and we shouldn't wait for journals or funders, even HHMI, to tell us how to do it. We need to just do it. And if we seize this moment as researchers, we can work to improve the speed, quality, and collegiality of the publication process and leave science in a better place. That's it.
Ron Vale, Executive Director from this place, Janelia is next.
Wow, what a great opening. Those were two very inspiring talks. I just want to say welcome to everyone here. I'm Ron Vale. I'm the Executive Director of Janelia. And it's a great pleasure to host all of you here on our campus for this very important discussion. So this is the third in a series of meetings at HHMI that have focused on the culture and the pragmatics of how we share and review scientific work in the life sciences. So this first meeting in 2016 talked about whether biologists, funders, and journals should embrace preprints, a practice that was well established in the physics community at the time, but was quite uncommon and, in fact, largely unknown in the life sciences to many. And I think a meeting like this, a gathering of individuals, and the discussion that followed was really impactful for what happened with preprints next. And you heard a little bit about this second meeting in 2018, which was on peer review, and also whether peer review should become more transparent and publicly available. And I think progress still needs to be made, but there was some momentum after that meeting. And I think that meeting also kind of stirred the waters for the precursor of the discussion we're having today. You heard about how PRC kind of evolved a little bit from really thinking about the problem at that meeting, and a lot of efforts in peer preprint review also were kind of stimulated, or at least the waters were stirred to think about this at this 2018 meeting. So this meeting is really following up on that, and it's going to discuss the reviewing of preprints, which were seeded at this 2018 meeting. And you heard also on these slides that between 2018 and 2022, there has been a lot of efforts and new efforts that have happened in these last 4 years. So it's a very timely moment to talk about this. So, I'd also thought I would share to this audience, and also recognizing that we have virtual attendees in many places, over a couple hundred who are listening to this meeting. So welcome to all of you as well. And I think the transparency of these meetings is indeed really very important and kind of embraces the spirit of what we're trying to accomplish. But so the opening remarks I gave in 2016, I think, are still very appropriate to this group today. So I'll just read them. All of you are very busy, but you felt it was important to be at this meeting. The reason that we are here and people are watching through the internet is that we are all deeply committed to science. We love our profession and believe in its importance. We represent different parts of the ecosystem. Some of us are practicing scientists, others are leaders of institutes or universities, representatives of funding agencies, societies, publishers, developers of new platforms. But for the next 24 hours, we are not representing our institutions or companies, but we're here as responsible citizens for science. And we are here because we want to do something good for the scientific community. And I think that is why we all are here and what unifies us here, for this meeting. So, this meeting will address perhaps even more complex subjects than the last two meetings, but the spirit of the meeting is really to listen to differing opinions and, importantly, to act as good stewards of science and making progress, a little bit in the spirit of what Jamie was saying, bit by bit, towards systems that are really going to be good for science. And I will also add, particularly for our early career scientists who are looking really to all of us as leaders to make progress in this area. So for my brief talk, I'm going to focus on this brief theme, which is really the purpose and the culture. I think the word culture has been brought up, and I think that's a very important point. And we've already discussed this, but the purpose of peer review, as I think we believe in it, is fundamentally a partnership. That was emphasized by Jamie's talk. It's a partnership of scientists producing and reviewing each other's work for the purposes of, quality, rigor, very much improving the clarity of a paper, and within reasonable limits, I will underscore the word reasonable, suggestions for additional experiments that could advance the scientific argument. It should be a spirit of collaboration and camaraderie, as Jamie said as well. And I think that is the direction we need to move in. So, as was also discussed, though, peer review has also become about advising whether a paper meets a bar for acceptance into a particular journal. And in my view, and I think many others, over the past few decades, more and more attention has been focused on this aspect of peer review, particularly for publications in what might call, elite journals. And the increasing attention for this really has arisen from the fact that publication in many journals has now become more and more competitive over time, and I and many others would use the word hyper-competitive. And I'm sure that many of you have received reviews of the work of your student after many years of work that really just remarks that this work is more suitable for another journal and provides really little of helpful information in terms of scholarly comments regarding the work, which is incredibly discouraging and disappointing even for the young scholars we're trying to train for this profession. So the reason is, I think that this trend towards gatekeeping is really a function that journals have created a system of artificial scarcity, publishing the same or fewer papers than decades ago, while the number of scientists globally contributing to the scientific enterprise has increased over time. So I think one of the key thoughts is whether preprint review would refocus peer review back on the science. And I think that is really an important topic for this meeting as well. So even in 2018, Vivian Siegel was part of that meeting, and she provided some insight at that time about her experiences with peer review in journals. And she said when a journal is new, and she's launched several of them, peer review would take on a different quality. Reviewers would write something like, I don't know how to advise you because I don't know what your standards are or what you want in the journal. So I guess I'll just have to tell you the strengths and weaknesses of the paper and you'll have to decide. Well, thank you, says Vivian. That's really what I wanted in the first place. But at the same time, authors would remark that reviews were unusually constructive, whether we choose to accept the paper or not. And the question is, rolling out from 2018, as we move to preprint review, would this be the case? Would we start moving the culture of peer review in the direction I believe that we all want to see it? And, as an outcome of this meeting, Maria Lepton and I co-founded with ASAP Bio and EMBO Review Commons. But there is data on the website, and you might hear more about it later, that the submitting authors did find the reviews to be more collegial, experiments proposed reasonable, and overall, people felt, in over 1,000 cases, that the journal-agnostic element of peer review was really a valuable part of the entire experience. So I think in the closing 1 minute here, I think I'll point out a topic that is also central to this meeting. You've heard about it, from Jessica in the opening, but that is also referring to what we have learned from the preprint experience, that if we want to nurture the growth of an effort, we also have to figure out how to assign value to it. I think this was an important element of the aftermath of the preprint meeting, that the fact that leading scientists in the community, funders, started to assign value and recognition of preprints was a very, very powerful driver in the growth of preprints by the scientific community. And I think one of the challenges for this meeting is, how do we really take this lesson that we learned from preprints and now start to think about how to apply that to peer review. So anyway, I'll finish by just saying again, hearty welcome to all of you, and thank you for coming, and looking for a fantastic day and a half of discussion. Thank you.
Our last keynote is by Fiona from the director of EMBO.
Thanks very much, Bodo. I've got the slides. I thought for this keynote I would give you a little bit of information about EMBO as an organization, because what it brings to this meeting is a primarily European perspective, the perspective of an organization which not only publishes but also funds, and an organization which feels really at its core that the senior life scientists who are internationally recognized have a responsibility to look out for the upcoming generations. And we have, fortunately, the freedom to experiment in the ways we do things. Oh, these aren't my slides. Let me just...
Yeah, it's not. I think we need to exit, because I made a few updates to mine. If
do you want me
exit
to?
And then play again, it doesn't update.
Okay.
Yeah. And then I bet you they're there
spot
now.
on, time-wise.
No, but
That's
I made a few.
perfect. Go up.
I made a. There we go.
Ta-da. Okay, thank you. So what is EMBO? It's an organization that is almost 60 years old, and when it was begun, the motivation was to create an environment across Europe where scientists could flourish. Back in the day, people used to say, well, your career will never take off unless you've been to America, you've got your BTA. And there was a feeling that surely in Europe it should be possible to do great science and do science across national boundaries. And there was also an aspiration to create a laboratory for molecular biology which would match CERN, which has been so important for physics. If we look to the present day, the money for EMBO comes from 30 different member states, so these can be large and small countries across Europe, and also 40 global partners. So we have this international funding and perspective. Each year, EMBO members will nominate other leading life scientists either in Europe or outside of Europe to be elected to become members. If you're elected to be a member of EMBO, We don't ask for any subscription fee. It's an honor for life. But we do expect you to do a fair amount of work for us in helping nurture the next generation of scientists. So in addition to having an active membership, we're involved in all of the processes that you can see listed on these slides. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I would highlight that because we provide postdoctoral fellowships, we provide training, and we have a publishing house, we have the opportunity to try to join the dots across these different activities. So I would say, as a sort of high-level statement, peer review is integral to almost all of our activities. Peer review of scientists by scientists is important, and so this is different from work being released into newspapers and discussed by journalists, which is important, but it's not the same as peer-to-peer comment. And I would also argue, well, I know there are many great scientists who are hopeless at peer review. And so I think being a good peer reviewer requires experience and training. And in amongst the training courses that EMBO offers, we see peer review as one of the key research skills that we should be teaching really early on. In fact, teaching PhD students, which comes back to Jamie's comment. So we do publish journals, and these are our 5 journals. The Life Science Alliance is a partnership with Cold Spring Harbor and Rockefeller University Press. The other 4 are solely EMBO Press journals. EMBO Molecular Medicine and Molecular Systems Biology have been open access since they were founded. The EMBO Journal and EMBO Reports are currently hybrid journals, but they will go fully open access in 2024. So we have, through our publishing activities, we cover different aspects of the life sciences. Now, you've heard about the phenomenal changes that have taken place in the scientific landscape in recent years. Richard Sever, who you'll hear from later, asked me if I would join the advisory board of bioRxiv many years ago. And I said yes, really, because it was Richard, but not really understanding what it meant. And of course, medRxiv, which was launched actually during the COVID pandemic, has, as you've heard, been incredibly important for sharing data. So really the next stage from socializing the importance of peer review is to move on to preprint peer review. And you've heard a lot about that from Ron and the other speakers. Of course, in EMBO, our major contribution has been through running Review Commons. You're going to hear much more about that later on. But essentially here, authors will post a preprint, they will receive peer review, and then having got the peer review, they make the decision of which of the 17 affiliate journals they would like to publish in. And the motivations for scientists for going through that route are quite variable. But I suppose speaking personally from as my science background, the journals that we would normally want to publish in are within this set of 17. And so rather than maybe go sequentially to several journals, going into Review Commons and then deciding based on the referees' reports is hugely efficient. It's much better than the previous system. In essence, as you've heard, peer review is a scarce resource. If you have reviews specific for individual journals, it's competitive, it's slow, it's not efficient. And so a distributed journal-agnostic peer review system is one which gives you increased efficiency, economies of scale, and importantly, a rational use of reviewers. So it's something that we feel, Review Commons has only been going since late 2019, but we can see already what the benefits are, and incorporating not only the posting of the preprints, but the reviews of the preprints is important. So to summarize, my thoughts on this are, as I've said, that preprint review saves time and resources. I think it's really important that it changes publication from being a binary process where you've either got no publications or publications to a continuum. This is really important for early career researchers who are on the job market. And, it's fine if you're a senior investigator funded by HHMI to post preprints, because you also have a huge CV with lots and lots of papers published elsewhere. But if you're solely being judged on your work as a postdoc and it's not published, this puts you at a real disadvantage in the job market. So changing the way we think about sharing our work is important. The transparency is important. Letting the author choose the journal is important. And something that I think is really important is that you see a lot of articles in the press about major papers which are being retracted. And of course there is bad behavior. People do make up their results. But I would argue that by and large, the problem is mistakes which are made early on, which could be corrected with training and being picked up early. And so the process of preprint review really makes science more robust because it ultimately avoids retractions. And then I would like to emphasize again that peer review of scientists by scientists is important because this is our community, and to push science forward, we need to embrace that concept. So with that, I will end and pass back to Bodo.
So before I hand it over to Iratxe, I just want to say a few words thanking the people that have made this workshop possible. There are the people on the organizing committee, Fiona Watt, Ron Vale, Janine, who did really her magic with organizing the whole logistics, and then Jessica Polka and Iratxe Puebla from ASAP Bio, who really are the brains behind the agenda, the content, and did the heavy lifting. I also want to thank the session chairs and the breakout moderators for taking on those roles, and the working groups that we hear later from. And finally, I want to thank Janelia and Janelia's staff for making this workshop such a pleasant experience for us and supporting us with food and this nice space. Thank you. And now over to Iratxe. Thank you. Who'll tell us about this.
Thank you so much, Bodo, and to Janelia for hosting us here, and also, of course, to everybody who's taking time out of their busy days to be here in the room or to follow us virtually. So we've had a nice set of inspiring presentations from the keynote speakers who have given us a little bit of the context for the meeting and also the opportunities for the next 2 days. In this next section, what we wanted to do was share a little bit of information that may give you some context as to how practices and experiences are evolving around preprint review that hopefully can help us inform some of the conversations they are going to be having. So to get us started, I wanted to present on the results from a survey that we opened earlier in November. We decided to have a public survey so that we could gather views from the community around their experiences and perspectives and views on preprint review. And one of the motivations really is that we understand that we have a varied set of experiences here represented, but that doesn't necessarily cover all the experiences from all demographics, from all researchers and other stakeholders out there. And we wanted to have an opportunity to collect some of those more diverse perspectives as well. So we ran this public survey. We had 230 responses. It was open to researchers, funders, and representatives of publishers and journals. We are going to be presenting mostly, actually, the responses from researchers and editors or publisher representatives because it was the bulk of the responses we received. So from researchers, we had 161 responses, and you can see here a little bit of the demographics. The majority of those who responded from that perspective were group leaders. Biology was highly represented in terms of disciplines. As you can see, almost 2/3 of the respondents indicated that they work in biological fields, a small representation from other fields, and in terms of geography, a strong representation from North America and Europe. So one of the first things that we asked as part of this survey is we wanted to see was the experience was from researchers with posting public feedback on preprints and also receiving public feedback on the preprints that they have authored themselves. And as you can see, the majority of the respondents said that they didn't have experience with this, either posting or receiving feedback. And for those that did have some experience, the stronger representation was around receiving brief comments or reactions or posting brief comments or reactions. So more in the format of comments on the preprint server or perhaps interactions through social media, and less experience with more detailed, in-depth reviews. We also wanted to understand what the potential challenges or concerns may be about these activities of sharing and receiving feedback and reviews on preprints. So on the top side, you can see the concerns related to posting public feedback on preprints. You can see top response was related to lack of time, although we could also argue that there is a link between that and the response related to incentives. So obviously, if we are rewarding an activity, it's more likely that there is priority and more time assigned to that. But another thing I thought I would highlight from the responses to that question in the context of posting public feedback is the fact that over 50 of the responses mention concerns about potential retribution if they sign the review. So that element, again, of whether the review will be anonymous or not is still in their minds. In the context of receiving public feedback on preprints that they had authored, the top two elements that were highlighted here was some concerns or questions as to what the quality and fairness of that feedback would be. And also, I guess, related to that as well, the second item around questions about the commenters' motivation, what would drive them to post those published comments on their work. And then we also wanted to understand a little bit what may be items that may make those researchers more likely to regularly contribute to these preprint feedback and review activities. So on the top side, you can see the responses to the question as to what of the different scenarios would make them more likely to regularly post preprint reviews. And as you can see, the main items that were going to act as motivators was knowing that the journals would incorporate the preprint reviews into editorial decisions or treat them as equivalent to reviews transferred from another journal. So this element of the reuse of those preprints as part of the editorial process, but also a strong interest in funders and institutions recognizing that preprints with reviews are equivalent or even superior by virtue of the public availability of that review to a peer-reviewed journal publication. The bottom graph, as you see, relates to a similar question, but in the context to requesting reviews on the preprints, and you can see that the pattern there is quite similar. In situations where the journals would reuse the public reviews on the preprints as part of the editorial process came top, but also a strong interest in having funders and institutions recognize those preprints with reviews. So that was the part relating to the responses from the researchers. As I mentioned, we also had a set of responses from respondents who are associated with journals or publishers. As you can see, the majority of the responses came from in-house editors or employees of publishers, or from active researchers who were responding in the capacity as editorial board members for the journal. Similar distribution here in terms of representation of particularly biology fields, so journal respondents coming from representing journals that cover biological fields, although also here, as you can see, almost a fifth of journals also covering multidisciplinary research. And in terms of journal geography, again, strongest representation from Europe as well as North America. So similarly to the section for researchers, we wanted to understand what the experience was from journals in terms of reusing feedback that had been posted on preprints. And as you can see, I think the clear pattern here is the fact that the respondents said that they had either not used that feedback or were not aware of it being reused. But from those who did express some experience with reusing that type of reviews, they noted that these were coming from preprint review platforms where they could incorporate reviews provided from those services into editorial decisions. We also asked about the motivations for journals for engaging with preprint reviews. As you can see, a variety of reasons listed there, but an important one, top one among those, that it is useful to have those preprint feedback and comments to signal whether there are any concerns that perhaps the editors need to bear in mind when they are considering that submission. And second, top from this set of responses, the ability of reducing that feedback to hopefully streamline and accelerate the editorial decision-making process. Similarly, we also wanted to understand what the barriers are for editors and journals in reducing this feedback on preprints. Again, another wide range of answers provided here. But I guess that the ones I would highlight, as you can see, in terms of receiving, most responses were that concerns or questions may be raised about the integrity of the feedback or the motivations of the commenter of the preprint. This really overlaps with what we saw coming from researchers. And a few other things that were highlighted is the fact that preprint feedback can live in different platforms, so it may be difficult to find all of these comments that may be on the preprint server, on third-party platforms, etc. And then obviously, importantly, the fact that this is not yet common practice. Very few preprints so far receive feedback, so tricky to incorporate those comments if they are non-present on the preprint copy. And finally, similarly to the other part of the survey, we also wanted to understand what may facilitate journals reusing those comments and reviews on preprints. The first question we asked was, we wanted to get a sense as to what was the appetite to receive reviews provided by platforms that have a more structured process, providing oversight of that peer review process versus reviews that may be posted by individuals themselves out of their own initiative. And as you can see, very strong preference for having reviews that come from these more structured platforms and processes. On the right-hand side, we incorporated different elements and asked about the interest or what was the assigned importance for the journal in terms of enabling that reuse of preprint reviews. Not surprisingly, the element of having a platform involved also came strongly there, but the top one was related to having reviews on preprints that include the reviewer ORCID or some institutional information that allows the verification of the identity of the reviewer. So some way of, again, verifying who's the person, at least their expertise, any competing interest, etc. Those were the responses to the survey. Again, I'm hoping that some of these will inform the discussions later in terms of what's the current practice, etc. But there was another element that we also wanted to share as part of this part of the program, and it's the fact that we also did some work with 2 working groups to try to discuss a little bit similar elements as you saw from the surveys. What are the current practices, the challenges, etc., and how can we hopefully facilitate implementation of use and recognition of reviews. So we're going to be hearing from the 2 working groups, starting from the first one that represented funders, researchers, and institutions. And this is going to be presented by Ashley Farley from Gates Foundation, whom I believe is online. Ashley, over to you.
Yes. Hello. Can I get a thumbs up that you can hear me?
Yes, all perfect.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So my name is Ashley Farley. I'm a program officer at Knowledge and Research Services at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and I'm excited to share our report from the working group. Next slide, please. So we've heard, I think, a lot of iteration of this question today so far, but to give more of a view from the working group of why we think that this is important and why preprint reviews should be incorporated into assessment, improving the science quickly. There's a certain kind of failure efficiency here. I think this ties into what we find is not working in the current system. We, again, are highlighting the kind of the culture change, normalizing participation, I think, in a much broader aspect in the scientific dialogue. So it takes down some barrier to entry. It really values the content of the review and makes it more of a scholarly output in its own right. Having managed a open post-peer review kind of preprint incorporated platform, we see a lot of really great peer reviews that are hosted there, and they're citable in their own right, and would love to see that become more of a common practice. And it adds a context of scientific landscape to the understanding of the paper. I also personally see a lot of great reviews, say, on Twitter, which is not a platform of where you can easily take those reviews elsewhere. So having a place where those reviews could live and be incorporated into the scientific landscape, I think, is really important. It helps make better use of researcher time. So again, it's been mentioned earlier, reviews are not used merely as a curation mechanism, but are really focused on the research itself and areas that it can improve, or also provide positive feedback, which I think is really important. And we do think it can provide an opportunity to address bias and kind of non-collegial feedback. I think especially transparency in these reviews can help kind of control for that a bit, and it allows anyone to be able to participate without being invited or not to give that feedback. And again, increasing transparency and opening up the scholarly communication process. Next slide. So here are some of our working definitions, and we, I think, recognize that it's important to define these clearly and well to communicate really what we want, how we want to see the system work, and kind of what these individual assets or outputs can look like. So we're definitely focused on rigor and validity of the research that's being discussed, and that's being the main focus. And then having reviewer competing interests addressed, either having that be checked by someone such as a editor or coordinator if available, or at least having that publicly declared by the viewer so any reader can read and assess that for themselves. And same with the reviewer identity. Again, verified, I think, ideally by an editor or coordinator, or at least be publicly declared. We also discussed a lot of having kind of an automated or a mechanism to have ORCID verification of who that reviewer is. And I wanted to highlight that in this, a lot of this is not built into the current system as a reader. So I may be reading a paper, but this information may not be available to me. And I'm trusting that someone behind the scenes has done this verification or check. But for transparency's sake, I would definitely wish that that would be available. And then talking about it with a preprint review, similar to kind of traditional reviews, would have at least 2 as described as above. And then here are a few examples that already currently provide that functionality. So this is building from what is already in the works. Next slide. So here's a table showing kind of some passive active endorsement or requirements of different elements of reviewed preprints. So we are seeing funders, institutions already building this into how they work. And this is really important in leading that culture change. And I definitely applaud these funders and institutions and labs making this a requirement. And this is truly, I think, leading the shift in how the uptake of reviewing preprints and giving recognition for that. So the elements on the left are kind of what is, recognition of preprints and research assessment, recognition of the refereed preprints, so having those reviews in the research assessment, recognition of reviews of preprints and research assessment, so those reviews alone, highlighting preprints and refereed preprints in maybe the outreach in doing their work, and also looking for, I think, potential fundees, and whether or not they request preprint reviews for their members. So these are different ways that we could see these elements of reviewed and preprint reviews being incorporated into the work and needs of the institution. Next. And digging down a little deeper, here are some sample policies. I, for one, strongly believe that policy is quite important to, one, build awareness, to, build that kind of culture and behavior change. We've seen through our work of, you can build policy, or you can build principles, but they aren't quite as strong as policies, which definitely get the attention of our grantees and external partners to really do something and take action. So I think it's important to highlight where there are sample policies and be able to assess how those are being enacted, implemented, and enforced. So there's different contexts in which these policies are being used between funders and institutions, whether it's in hiring or reviewing grants, and then reporting, monitoring, and evaluating on kind of program impact. So there is a growing momentum of this, and I think, again, it's important that we have these examples to build upon. Next. So what are the challenges and limitations? Of course, as you can probably guess, there are many, but again, I do think we should adopt the just do it method and start really pushing for this change and work on improving the systems as they go. I think many of these are issues that also plague our current systems. But we definitely need recognition for reviews, and we must build upon recognition for preprints themselves. So recognizing that in some disciplines and fields, preprints can be still fairly new, that the requirements and policies around having them are still somewhat new. So we need to build upon that. And as we've seen, I think some of the survey results reflect a lot of these challenges and limitations and need for capacity building. Scaling the need to ensure preprint reviews are accessible to researchers. So when we talk about, access to information and kind of the, I think, overload of what's already available and seeing the linkages on the accessibility, discoverability, all of those will also apply to preprint reviews. And in that, needing infrastructure to connect kind of the distributed network of reviews for preprints. So we want to make this easier and accessible so we can tell that strong story of the article and the associated reviews, again, because this work is much more of a conversation in improving science and research and not just a curation tool. Majority of existing reviews are not transparent or they can't be accessed easily. They're kind of lacking that validation or that trust in who made this review. What are their affiliations? What are potential conflicts of interest? So ideally, all of those elements would be much more transparent to the reader. There's a ratcheting of requirements. We have a need of preserving the value of a standalone preprint. And again, there's a lot of acknowledgement that time and energy and capacity is limited of researchers and reviewers. I also love hearing earlier that there's also definitely almost an art form and an expertise to providing those reviews. We want to make sure that that's recognized, but at the same time that no one is left out, and we build that capacity to be able to have strong expertise and confidence in reviews. And valuing openness to engage in discourse. Assessment within reviews does not necessarily determine the quality of the paper. And I think that's important to keep in mind as well. And that there should be, I think, always an opportunity to improve upon what reviews you receive and be able to take that feedback critically and produce different versions of the paper from there. Next slide. Awesome. And that is it from me. And thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Ashley, for that presentation on that working group. Next, we're going to have a presentation from the second working group that had representatives of journals and preprint review services, so looking a bit more about the reuse of preprint feedback and reviews from the journal as a user side of things. So for this, we have Catriona MacCallum from Hindawi.
Thanks very much, Iratxe. So this working group, and again, it's very much from the perspective of journals and how preprint feedback, preprint review can be incorporated within the journal process. And we've heard a lot about the benefits of preprints and preprint reviews more generally. And similarly, for journals, it increases diversity in review. It allows greater scrutiny. We get essentially potentially more reviewers to pick up items within the articles. It increases transparency and allows scrutiny of the reviews themselves, which I think is incredibly important for all the reasons that actually have been addressed today. But without, there's a lot of reviewing that goes on that is undercover, and this itself is not healthy for the system. And of course, ultimately, we hope it will actually provide a faster service for the authors themselves if we can use reviews that are picked up early on in the process and where there's a discourse around those public reviews. And finally, for journals, it also increases efficiencies. And so potentially that could both not just increase speed, but help drive costs down. It's unclear at the moment, but it allows reuse of reviews and reduces also reviewer burden. So Jessica has already spoken about this, but we, for the purposes of these recommendations, we're focusing on two classifications, what we're either calling preprint feedback, which is essentially any public commentary on a preprint that adds to the scholarship, that adds to the understanding of the article in question, and a preprint review, which is a more formal, more detailed process that provides transparency about the integrity of the evaluation itself. And it's a review that journals can use to inform their editorial decision. And we thought there were two essential elements to this, and this echoes very much what the funders are also asking about. One is that that review needs to contain some sort of assessment of the rigor and the validity of the research, and it needs some sort of verifiable information, direct or indirect, about the reviewer that allows their expertise and any competing interests to be checked. So it's great there is that alignment. And essentially there are four types of scenarios where preprint feedback can be, or preprint review can be used within the journal context. And one is just using that feedback to inform whether the journal itself sends an article out for peer review. Another might be deciding to highlight a particular paper. And again, these are platforms which already provide these sorts of functionality like pre-lights. It could add as an additional information source to inform editorial decisions, and so pre-review is currently operating like that. Or it could actually be used wholesale to replace the existing journal peer review process or add it onto it actually as a transferred review. And there's already platforms that are doing that as well. The working group went through quite a lot of discussion about the various elements that would be needed to provide the sort of baseline for any one of those scenarios to happen. And so informing whether to send a paper for review, you'd need to have the public review reports associated with the preprint and the reviewer identity, and that would be the sort of two minimum elements, and that's essentially how PubPeer operates at the moment. Deciding to highlight a paper, you essentially need those same two elements, but you also would want an assessment of the novelty or the relevance or the advance of the field. And I suppose this is going back to the curation side of the publish review curation side and whether journals fulfill that function, or indeed other organizations or societies could potentially do that. And then informing editorial decisions after review. Again, you need those same three elements that must have the assessment of rigor and validity. And again, pre-review is using that, and reviews are being used to inform editorial decisions. And then finally, using a preprint review wholesale as part of the peer review process in a journal context. You need all of those elements. Again, I think there's a lot of discussion that you can have around these things, and we did certainly in the peer within the working group, because there are sound science journals, objective journals like PLOS One, the assessment of the novelty, where the assessment of the novelty of the work is not relevant to the publication, and so you could see that those sorts of elements not being used by some journals. For the for some journals, however, they would only use it where there are a whole set of features where there is a coordinator and editor to manage the conflicts of interests. We'd have to be ensured of which version we were looking at of the preprint, whether it was the original submission or the revised submission. There would need to be an author response to any of those comments by the reviewers. And again, open data, open code, that might also need to be associated with it, and some form of structured assessment. And this is much more with the platforms which are organizing and coordinating the review of preprints, such as Review Commons or PCI or even eLife. I think there is a huge amount of variation and spectrum in this about where journals might use the reviews of preprints that is probably very dependent on the journal's own view of what peer review is, with, I think, potentially all the biases that can have within it. We know that there is already progress in incorporating preprint feedback and reviews into journal editorial processes. And again, the Funder Working Group and other speakers this morning have talked about this. Essentially, most journals now allow preprints. No one stops it. I'm not sure of Cell's most recent policy. They used to advocate against it, but I'm not sure at the moment. But there is no objection to authors receiving feedback or reviews on their preprint. They're generally just not integrated in any formal way, and so it's sort of partly by luck if they're picked up, I think. And then there are journals that actually have started to enable it in their journal workflows, so Review Commons, Peer Community In, and PeerRef, the partner journals. And again, that forms, in some ways, it forms a sort of group of journals with potentially common standards or common understandings about how that review operates. We have a lot of challenges and caveats and questions, and I think this actually speaks to the heart of the question about the role of journals, the control that they exert over peer review, which is, I think, speaking to Ron's discussion this morning. One of the more contentious discussions we had was who counts as a peer. Should this be called preprint peer review or preprint review? Who makes the decision about who an expert is and who a peer is? And I think at the moment that would be very much controlled by the journals themselves. I think there's, and this is I'm speaking personally, there is a big issue we know about the inequity and bias within the existing peer review system, and having gatekeepers on who gets to decide who to contribute, whether a scientist or patient advocacy groups, again, is a very, very tricky question. We also had discussions about whether you could, how important it was to have a structured process in order to balance the expertise of different reviewers, having some coordinator enabling authors to provide a response, and whether that's built in to the process within the journals that would somehow enable them to consider preprint reviews more easily. And I think there's also, again, we're hearing a lot that we need many more technical solutions to actually, first of all, get authors to preprint their articles, then to get reviews on top of preprints. And this has to be as frictionless as possible for reviewers and for authors to do, and for editors if they are to do it. If you add on any burden into the system, which is already creaking, they're just not going to do it. If we can find a way to make this straightforward and completely easy, it's far more likely to happen. And of course, we've been talking a lot about the culture, and there's massive cultural barriers, not least the dominance of journal brand and rank and control. I think it was very interesting in the survey that Iratxe produced that the two most important items for whether a reviewer might contribute reviews or not, or an author would consider them, is whether the journal policy would take it and what impact whether the journal would have it. And that still just shows, that it's the dominance of what the journal wants. So I think that's it. I'm sure there's lots to discuss, and my fellow working group members will do that. Thanks very much.
Right, thanks so much, Catriona, for the presentation from the working group that involved journals and preprint review platforms. I think we had this additional slide, but I think that's fine. I can read it for you. We wanted to end on a more positive note with the possible steps for journals. I don't think any of this will be very surprising to those of you who have been following this ecosystem. But we suggested having clearer policies on the journal side. We know that even around acceptance of preprints, there is not always a very clear policy. So having some policy that designates that journals will accept this type of preprint review and feedback would be useful. Obviously, allowing authors to sell that preprint feedback and reviews through the submission process. This, what Catriona was mentioning about surfacing this for editors, making their lives a little bit easier so that they can incorporate this. If your journal is very interested in engaging with this, there is, as we mentioned, a diverse ecosystem of preprint review platforms, so consider discussing with them a potential partnership. And we have already had a mention earlier on to the Publish Your Reviews initiative. It's an initiative to encourage reviewers to post their own reviews on preprints. So again, it can be really helpful for journals to signal that they are happy for the reviewers to do this and that they actually encourage them to share those reviews. Right, so we hope that some of these discussions and the items from the survey will be useful as we enter the discussions later on today and tomorrow. But before we get into any of that, we also wanted to, get the temperature in the room here, but also for those of us, who are following virtually, about a few of the items that have already been raised regarding conversations, for example, from the working groups. So this is the first section where we are going to be using slido.com for a couple of live polls. So if you do not yet have slido.com open, head there now. Again, has preprint, and you should be able to see the polls. So let's see. The first one relates to all of these references that we had about our working definitions and the terminology that we are using about referring to preprint reviews. So what we propose here, and we wanted to see what your perspectives were on this, is that we had indicated that to be considered a review, feedback on a preprint, again, that review would be a subset of the broader feedback activities. To be considered review, feedback on a preprint has at a minimum rigor and validity of the results discussed, reviewer competing interests addressed publicly or checked by the editor, and some identification for the reviewer identity. Essentially, some way of knowing who the reviewer is, or to verify that identity privately or through sharing that information with the editor, providing the ORCID for the reviewer. So I wanted to see if there was agreement around this. I'm going to let the survey run for a little bit more to see if there is any other answers to this. It's positive to see a lot of green here so far on the agreement, but I just want to make sure that there is further opportunities to respond to this. So I'll leave it open for a few more seconds. Oh, and something else I wanted to mention in the context here, for those of you who may say, actually, I'm not sure this fully resonates with me, there is going to be an option for anybody who may want to suggest modifications to this as well as part of the poll. So feel free to pick that if that's your choice, and there will be an opportunity to share feedback. I'll leave it open for a few more seconds to make sure there is an opportunity to contribute. Okay, so I saw the number of responses growing. So again, I'm going to leave it for a few more seconds. Feel free to add your vote if you haven't already. Okay, I'm seeing that the number of responses seems to be slowing down, so I'm just going to do the final countdown of from 3, and then we'll move on to the next question in the poll. So if you haven't yet added your vote, please do so now, and we'll move on in 3, 2. Okay, this is when everyone gets voting very quickly. Now it's the final, last second, so we're going to be moving on. So we have 73 responses. Okay, we see agreement from 3/4 of the audience. I think I'm very pleased to see, and the other members of the working groups will be pleased to see that there is some agreement around this. We didn't totally get this off track. So good to see, but there was also 22% of respondents who said, okay, we agree with this, but maybe we'd like to nuance this or add to it. Which was the next question in the poll, asking for some suggestions. Again, if you think that there needs to be any modifications to the statement, what would it be? Okay, and you see some of the suggestions there. This element about anonymous reviews, essentially this has come up already, whether the reviews would be signed or not. Do we have any way of not only knowing who the reviewer is, but also protecting those who may fear some retribution, again, validation of reviews, so this identity element being important in that context. Some comments about the structure, interesting. Yeah, do we need to provide quite a bit more detail around that to make that count as a review? Okay, some comments about the competing interests being important, but also knowing the expertise of the reviewers. Again, what Catriona was explaining, who counts as a peer, how do we define that, and knowing that it can be very different from one person to another. And again, some more comments about expertise. I'm just going to leave this a few more moments in case there are additional answers. Oh, can I do this with? Sorry. Oh.
And then you can go. Okay.
Oh, thank you. Sorry.
Cool. So you can do that. Okay.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Okay, so we can read a few more here. Expertise. Again, more comments about the anonymity of reviewers. Validating the expertise of the reviewer. Okay, let's see. Some nuance about the terminology related to rigor or validity, saying it needs to cover this and not just discuss it, essentially having some clear sense as to what the work is rigorous. Comments about the license and can we have that review available through an open access license. Again, more comments about anonymity of reviews. Some more comments on that. Okay, I think the majority of the remaining comments relate to the identity, so I think that's also another important element that will come through in future conversations. Let me make sure that I've gotten to the bottom and not excluded anybody. Okay, how will the review be received by the others and by others? Is it constructive and helpful? And then, again, more comments around identification. Just going to give it 2 seconds because somebody's typing. It's the usual thing when you say countdown, everybody types furiously. So just a couple more seconds. Again, if you are typing your response, please submit now. We have an additional question on the poll. So let me just try to display the remaining one. I don't know if it's coming here. Let's see if it's at the top. Okay, I think we have covered the majority of it. It seems to me in terms of themes, obviously a lot of comments about the anonymity, the name, how do we, for both sides, protecting the reviewer, but also in terms of potential reuse, how can the individual reusing that review get some sense as to what the expertise and other potential aspects related motivations or competing interests are, the element about the structure, and perhaps giving a bit more stronger wording as to how some of the aspects of rigor and other elements of the review are included. Okay, there was a third question on this poll. So I'm just going to move on, which was, we also wanted to see what the views were about the terminology to use around preprint review specifically. Catriona has mentioned in the second working group, this was something that generated quite a bit of discussion and back and forth as to whether we should just say preprint review more broadly or specify preprint peer review and narrow down a little bit more about having an expert involved. Again, acknowledging that defining who's an expert may vary from one person to another. So I wanted to see what the broader views were on this, and I see that there are also potentially different opinions here. I'm not sure we'll have a consensus between now and the end of tomorrow, but interesting to see that the majority of respondents on this poll at least seem to prefer to keep the broader preprint review. Again, nuances as to how we define that as we saw in the earlier polls, but interesting to see that that appears to be, at least for now, the favor option in terms of terminology. Well, thank you to all of you here and online who contributed to the poll. We're going to continue to use slido.com for a couple of other polls. I think they're coming up tomorrow, but do keep this open because it's the place where we are going to be gathering questions and comments you may have. I think that what's coming up next is that we're having a break. As Janine explained earlier, there is no Q&A after the individual presentations because we're going to batch all of the comments and questions together in the discussion sections that are part of the program. So fear not if you have comments or want to react to any of this. We're going to come back to this in the next part of the program. We are having a break now. Important notice to come back in around 20 minutes, I believe, if I have my timer right over there, in around 20 minutes. So this is 11 a.m. For those here, 4 p.m. UTC for anybody who may be in a different time zone. So just be sure to tune back at 11 a.m. here, and we will continue the discussion. And thank you so much to the speakers this morning. Thank you.